My daughter-in-law inherited $72 million after my son passed away. The first thing she did was throw me out of the house he and I had built together. She looked me dead in the eyes and told me to go rot in the street where no one would ever find me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked up my coat, walked away, and made a single phone call. 5 days later, she was on her knees, trembling, begging me for a single dollar. She should have listened more carefully when the will was read. She should have realized my son knew exactly who she was. Before I continue, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel if you believe that patience and wisdom are stronger than cruelty and greed. The day after we buried my son Ethan, the silence in his house was unbearable. Not the soft silence of mourning, but the cold, brittle kind that feels like glass waiting to shatter. I sat in his leather armchair, the one he and I picked out together years ago, and stared at the empty space beside me. The walls seemed to echo with his absence. Every corner of that house was filled with him. The way the morning light hit the wooden floors we had laid side by side, the scent of the old books in the library we built together, the quiet hum of the servers in the basement that powered the company he had created from nothing. Then I heard it, the sharp click of heels on hardwood echoing down the staircase. That sound cut through the house like a blade. It was not the step of grief. It was the step of someone already moving on, already plotting. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, descended the stairs. She wasn't dressed in black. She wore a fitted cream-colored suit, tailored to perfection, as if she had been waiting for this day. Her perfume filled the room before she did, sweet and expensive, suffocating in its arrogance. She didn't so much as glance at me. She pulled out her phone and began speaking, her voice crisp, cold, businesslike. "No, we can't wait until next quarter," she said firmly as she walked past me into the kitchen. "We need to liquidate the assets immediately. It's about maximizing returns. The past is the past." Her words sliced through me like knives. My son had just been laid to rest, and here she was, erasing him like a name written in dust. I sat there in silence, gripping the arms of the chair, feeling more like a discarded relic than a man. She hadn't even buried his memory before burying his legacy. In that moment, I knew. The storm was only beginning, and I was about to be swept into it. The very next morning, I found myself sitting in the polished mahogany conference room of my son's lawyer. The walls smelled of leather and old paper, a scent that carried memories of another time, back when Ethan was just a boy chasing impossible dreams. I had known Mr. Callahan, the lawyer, for almost 20 years. He had watched my son grow up, had guided him when his little startup was no more than sketches on napkins. Now, here we were, gathered to divide the life's work of the boy I had raised. My hands rested on the table, steady but cold, as if carved from stone. Vanessa sat across from me. Her posture was perfect, her back straight, her chin lifted like she was at a board meeting instead of her husband's will reading. She wasn't grieving. She wasn't even pretending. She sat there like a conqueror, her perfectly manicured fingers clasped together, her eyes hard and sharp. Not a widow, not a woman in mourning, but a CEO ready to seize power. Mr. Callahan cleared his throat and put on his glasses, his voice heavy with duty. He began to read Ethan's last will and testament. The words came slowly, legal jargon threaded with finality, but the core was painfully simple. Clause after clause outlined what was to happen to my son's estate. His controlling shares in the tech company he had built, valued at more than $72 million. His portfolio of investments, his cars, his art collection, the house, every piece of it was left to his wife, Vanessa Miller. My name was mentioned once, a single sterile sentence buried in the middle of it all. To my father, Samuel Miller, I leave my gratitude for being my first teacher and my greatest supporter. That was it. Nothing more. I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. I didn't care about fortunes or houses. What cut me was the feeling of being erased, of being nothing more than a footnote in my own son's life story. I turned my head slightly and looked at Vanessa. She didn't look back, but I caught it, the smallest curl of her lips, the ghost of a smile that wasn't sorrow or respect. It was victory, pure, cold victory. I thought back to a night 2 decades earlier, in a dingy diner where Ethan had first shown me his business plan. I remembered sliding my life savings across the table, everything I had, telling him it wasn't a risk but an investment in him. Now, all of that, all of me, was sitting in Vanessa's polished hands, and when the lawyer's voice rose, he finally trailed off, leaving only silence in the room. I realized my son's story wasn't over. It was about to be rewritten by the one person who least deserved the pen. When we returned to the house after the will was read, I walked through the door carrying nothing but silence. The air inside was thick, colder somehow, as though the walls themselves understood that something sacred had been broken. Vanessa moved through the rooms not like a grieving widow, but like an inspector, her eyes scanning every corner as though she were appraising it all for sale. She trailed her fingers along the framed photographs on the wall, pictures of Ethan as a boy, of fishing trips he and I had taken together, of his late mother whose smile once filled this home. Vanessa's expression didn't soften. Instead, she wrinkled her nose. "All of this has to go," she said sharply, almost to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. "We need a cleaner, more modern look. No clutter, no mess." Her voice echoed in the room, hollow and merciless. I watched as she shifted her gaze toward the bookshelf, the one filled with Ethan's most cherished first-edition novels. He had spent years building that collection, rare treasures he hunted down with the passion of a man who found pieces of his soul in their pages. She didn't see treasures, she saw dollar signs. "These can be sold," she muttered. "I'm sure they're worth something." Her phone buzzed, and she answered it without hesitation, her voice suddenly bright and triumphant. "Yes, it's confirmed. 72 million, not including the property. Complete control. All mine now." Her words sliced through me like a blade. She was no longer hiding what she was. She was announcing it, declaring her territory while looking straight at me. In that moment I understood. I wasn't a member of this house anymore. I wasn't family. I was an obstacle, a ghost haunting her new empire. She wasn't mourning Ethan. She was celebrating his absence. For 2 days, I sought refuge in the library. It was the only room she hadn't touched yet. The shelves we had built together reached the ceiling, filled with volumes that smelled of ink and dust and history. I ran my hands along the spines, straightened a crooked book, breathed in the faint echo of my son's presence. This was our sanctuary, a place where the two of us had lived 1,000 conversations and built dreams out of words. But even here, in this cathedral of memory, I knew she would come. She was circling, waiting, ready to claim it too. And when she finally did, she would not come alone. She would come armed with her new authority, her false confidence, and the merciless greed that had been waiting all along. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a battlefield, and I knew I was about to lose the last piece of my son that still remained untouched. It happened on the 3rd day. I was in the library dusting a row of Ethan's favorite hardcovers when the heavy oak door slammed open with a crack that rattled the shelves. Vanessa stood there, framed in the doorway, flanked by 2 men who looked more like hired movers than friends. Their arms were thick, their faces blank, and they filled the doorway like shadows sent to erase whatever light remained. Vanessa was dressed in sleek athletic wear, her hair tied back in a severe ponytail, her eyes sharp with impatience. She didn't even glance at the shelves or the treasures they held. Instead, she gestured broadly with a perfectly manicured hand. "All right, this is the space," she announced to the men. "You see all this? The wood, the shelves, the dusty old books? Dead weight. I want it gone. We're putting in new equipment here. Treadmills, weights, mirrors. By Friday, this will be a proper gym." Her words struck me like a physical blow. I set the book in my hands carefully back on the shelf and turned to face her, my voice steady even as my chest trembled. "Vanessa," I said softly, "this isn't junk. This was Ethan's collection, his sanctuary. This room is the heart of the house. It's where his memory lives." The men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, as though they too felt the weight of what I was saying. But Vanessa only laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no warmth. "Memory?" she sneered. "What good are memories, Samuel? You can't liquidate memories. You can't trade them. They don't pay dividends. This is my house now, my life, and you're not a part of it." Her voice rose with each word until it echoed off the shelves like a cruel chant. Then she stepped forward, her finger stabbing the air at me. "I am tired of you skulking around here like a ghost, touching everything, clinging to the past. I don't want to see you here anymore. Do you understand? You're not welcome in this house. Get out. Go die in a dumpster for all I care." Before I could answer, she snapped her fingers at the 2 men. "Get him out of here." They moved quickly, one on each side of me. Their hands clamped down on my arms like iron grips, not malicious but efficient, like I was a piece of unwanted furniture to be carried out. I didn't resist. My feet stumbled across the Persian rug as they dragged me toward the door. I looked back once, at the shelves Ethan and I had built together, at the room that still smelled faintly of his presence. Then the door slammed shut behind me, and I was no longer in my son's heart. I was in exile. The slam of the front door echoed like a judge's gavel, final and merciless. A second later, I heard the metallic click of the deadbolt turning, sealing me out of the life I had built with my son. I stood on the stone pathway, the manicured lawn stretching out on either side, and there at my feet sat a battered leather suitcase. She had packed it for me. I could almost see her hands touching my worn sweaters and old books with disdain, before stuffing them inside like they were trash. For a long moment I just stood there, the gray sky pressing down, the air sharp with the chill of early autumn. Then came the first drop of rain, cold, relentless. It streaked down my cheek and blended with the silent tears I hadn't realized were falling. Within minutes the drizzle grew into a steady rain, soaking through my thin coat, plastering my hair to my forehead. I turned back toward the house, our house, and my heart twisted. The bay window of the library stared back at me like an empty eye socket, dark and lifeless. I remembered how Ethan had insisted on that window so he could read with the morning light streaming in. I remembered the stone facade around the entryway, the weekend he and I spent laying those rocks by hand, our palms blistered, but our spirits high. Every brick, every floorboard, every nail carried a memory of him. And now it was all shut behind that locked door, guarded by greed and arrogance. The humiliation settled in my stomach like a stone. I was nothing to her now, less than nothing. A ghost tossed out onto the lawn, standing in the rain with only a suitcase and a lifetime of broken promises. I thought of Ethan's words, spoken years ago when he was just a boy helping me mend a fence in our old yard. "One day, Dad," he had said with fire in his young eyes, "I'm going to build us a house so strong and so big you'll always have a place in it. It won't be my house. It'll be ours." That promise had lived in me ever since, carved into my soul like scripture, and that was what Vanessa had truly destroyed. Not the books, not the furniture, not even the fortune. She had desecrated his promise. She had turned it into ashes. I straightened my back despite the cold, despite the weight of grief pressing on me. This was not the end. I might have been standing in the rain like a forgotten relic, but something inside me hardened, sharp and cold as steel. Vanessa thought she had won, that she had locked me out forever, but she had only made her first move, and now it would be my turn. The rain followed me all the way to the curb, soaking me until I could hardly feel my fingers gripping the handle of that worn suitcase. I must have looked like a ghost, an old man in his 70s, his life reduced to a bag of clothes and memories, standing on the edge of a street that no longer wanted him. A yellow taxi slowed as it passed, its headlights slicing through the drizzle. I raised my hand, and the driver pulled over without a word. His eyes flicked up at me in the rear-view mirror, but he didn't ask questions. Maybe he could see the story written in my face. Maybe he knew it was too heavy to touch. "Where to, sir?" he asked softly. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to be taken to a friend's house and forced to see my own shame reflected in their eyes. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would find me. A name rose from memory like a ghost. The Crestview Motel, an old place far out on the highway where people went when they didn't want to be found. "Crestview Motel," I muttered, and he nodded. The ride passed in a blur of smeared city lights and the steady thump of windshield wipers. Each beat seemed to whisper, "What now? What now? What now?" The suburbs faded into strip malls, then into gray stretches of road lined with warehouses and abandoned gas stations. Finally, the neon sign appeared through the rain, buzzing weakly, a few letters missing. It read, "Crestview Motel," like the place itself was crumbling piece by piece. The clerk barely looked at me when I checked in. He slid a key across the counter with the disinterest of a man who had seen too many fallen souls. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew. The carpet was threadbare, the bed sagged in the middle, and the single lamp on the nightstand cast a weak yellow glow that barely touched the corners. It was the opposite of the grand house I had just been thrown out of. The mansion had been filled with light and art and flowers, a monument to Ethan's success. This place was filled with silence, dust, and the ghosts of other people's failures. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the hum of the ancient mini-fridge and the hiss of cars passing on the wet highway. For the first time since Ethan's funeral, I was truly alone. But it wasn't the silence of defeat anymore. It was something else, something quieter, sharper. My mind turned over the events of the last few days, and a question clawed its way to the surface. Ethan was brilliant. He was careful. He planned for everything. Could he really have been so blind? Could he really have left me with nothing? Or had he left me with something I hadn't yet seen? That thought flickered inside me like a tiny flame in the darkness. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was enough to keep me breathing. I sat there on the sagging bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, the rain tapping a steady rhythm against the window. My suitcase rested by the door, half open, my life spilling out in a heap of old shirts and a worn pair of shoes. The silence pressed in, but beneath it was that flicker of suspicion I couldn't shake. Ethan was no fool. He had built an empire out of thin air, predicting trends years before anyone else even noticed them. Could a man like that have really left his father with nothing but a line of gratitude? I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. For a long moment, I just held it in my hand, feeling the cool weight of it, my thumb hovering over the screen. I scrolled past names I couldn't bear to call, friends who would pity me, old colleagues who would see me as a broken relic. Then I stopped at one name, Mr. Callahan, my son's lawyer, the man who had read that will with eyes that seemed almost too heavy, like he was carrying something more than words. My chest tightened. Was it surrender or defiance to make this call? I pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, professional but edged with fatigue. Callahan speaking. I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay steady, calm, detached, as though I were reporting on some piece of history instead of my own humiliation. Good evening, Mr. Callahan. I wanted to inform you that I am no longer residing at my son's house. Vanessa made it clear I was not welcome. I've taken a room at the Crestview Motel on the interstate. There was silence on the other end, heavy and knowing. Then I heard it, the slow, weary sigh of a man who had been holding a secret for too long. Samuel, he said quietly, and for the first time his voice wasn't professional. It was the voice of a friend. I am so sorry you had to endure that. Truly. But I cannot say I am surprised. Not surprise. DT. The words jolted me upright. The suspicion that had been flickering inside me roared into something brighter, hotter. My son had known. He must have known. Callahan's voice dropped lower, almost reverent. Ethan was a planner, Samuel. He loved her, in his own way, but he wasn't blind. He always had contingencies. He always prepared for the worst. I closed my eyes, a memory hitting me like lightning. Ethan late at night, hunched over his laptop, his brow furrowed, his screen filled with documents he never explained. Back then, I thought it was work. Now, sitting in that dim motel room, I realized it had been something more. A shield. A plan. And when Callahan spoke again, his words cut through the silence with the weight of destiny. There's something I need to tell you, something your son left behind. And now, Samuel, the time has come for you to hear it. I gripped the phone tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. The motel room around me seemed to fade away. The peeling wallpaper, the stale air, the hum of the mini-fridge, all of it dissolved into nothing but Callahan's voice. He spoke slowly, carefully, each word like a key turning in a hidden lock. Samuel, he said, what we read the other day was not the full story. It was true in the eyes of the law, yes, but it was not complete. Ethan left behind something else. Something I was bound not to reveal until a very specific condition was met. My breath caught. And that condition? Callahan's tone sharpened. Her actions. By forcibly removing you from the house, Vanessa triggered that condition. Ethan called it his character test. He wanted to see if she would honor his legacy, his family, or if she would betray it. He hoped she might surprise him, but he prepared for the truth he feared. I closed my eyes, the memory of Ethan's tired but steady gaze flashing before me, late nights when he looked older than his years, carrying a weight I didn't understand. Now I finally did. He hadn't been blind. He had been planning for this very moment. Callahan continued, his voice low and deliberate. The will that left everything to Vanessa was bait. It was designed to give her exactly what she thought she wanted. But there was a clause hidden in plain sight, Samuel, a binding clause that tied her inheritance to a solemn fiduciary duty. I frowned. Fiduciary duty? Yes, he said firmly. The will required her, for a 30-day evaluation period, to uphold and protect the welfare of the Miller family and preserve Ethan's legacy. Those weren't just sentimental words, they were legally enforceable. And by throwing you out, by telling you to rot in the street, she shattered that duty in the most undeniable way possible. I sat up straighter on the bed, my pulse quickening. The humiliation I had felt days ago began to melt into something else, something harder, sharper. Callahan pressed on. That breach gives me, as executor, full authority to unseal a second document, a codicil Ethan left in my care. Samuel, your son was brilliant. He didn't just write a will, he built a system, a test. He wanted her greed to reveal itself, and he wanted you to be protected when it did. My throat tightened. For days I had thought Ethan had erased me, left me behind like a relic. But now I saw the truth. He hadn't abandoned me. He had armed me. Even from beyond the grave, my son had been protecting me. What happens now? I whispered. There was a pause, and then Callahan's voice became steel. Now, Samuel, we play the game the way Ethan designed it, and I promise you, she has no idea what's coming. I leaned forward on the bed, the phone pressed tight to my ear, every nerve straining to catch each word. Callahan's voice was calm, deliberate, like a professor explaining a brilliant piece of strategy. Ethan knew his wife, Samuel. He knew her weaknesses, her vanity, her greed, her impatience. He gave her everything in that first will, but he tied it all to her ability to protect the family's welfare. That clause wasn't just for sentiment, it was the trigger, and she pulled it the moment she threw you out. I swallowed hard, my hand tightening around the phone. So what does that mean? What happens now? Callahan exhaled slowly. Now the estate shifts into the second stage of Ethan's plan. As executor, I will begin placing procedural holds on every major asset, bank accounts, investment portfolios, company shares, even the property itself. All of it will appear to her as though it's still hers, but she won't be able to touch a single cent. Every attempt she makes to access those funds will be met with delays, audits, and valuation processes. Legally airtight, completely standard on paper, but deliberately slow. I could almost see it as he spoke, Vanessa clutching at her wealth like a queen, only to find the treasury empty, every door locked, every path blocked. Callahan's tone grew firmer. Your role is just as important as mine, Samuel. You must disappear. For this to work, she has to believe you're defeated, broken, out of the way. That absence will embolden her. She'll act recklessly, spending and flaunting what she thinks she owns, digging herself deeper into the trap Ethan set for her. I stared at the weak lamp on the nightstand, the cracked lampshade throwing crooked shadows across the room. For the first time in days, those shadows didn't feel like they were swallowing me. They felt like cover, like protection. So I vanish, I said quietly. Yes, Callahan replied. Don't call friends. Don't answer your phone. Let her believe you've disappeared into obscurity. She will celebrate her victory. She will grow careless, and when she does, we'll have all the proof we need. A strange calm settled over me. I had spent days feeling like a ghost, stripped of dignity, cast aside. But now I saw it differently. I wasn't a ghost. I was the unseen player in a game my son had designed years ago, and Vanessa, in her arrogance, was walking straight into checkmate without even realizing it. Callahan's final words that night stayed with me long after the call ended. Your son trusted you, Samuel. He left you this role because he knew you'd have the patience to see it through. Trust him now. Trust the system he built. Justice is already in motion. I hung up the phone and sat back against the lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling with new eyes. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. After the call ended, I sat in that dim motel room for a long time, staring at the black screen of my phone. The silence was thick, but it no longer felt suffocating. It was different now. It was purpose. A fool. The rain had stopped outside, and the faint hiss of passing cars was the only sound, like the world itself had quieted to let me think. I thought of Ethan, my son, my boy, whose mind had always worked like a master chess player. He never moved without calculating 5 steps ahead, and now, even in death, he had left me the board and the pieces, with the strategy already in motion. The will Vanessa clung to was nothing more than bait, a glittering prize designed to expose her, and she had taken it eagerly, showing the world exactly who she was. For a fleeting moment, anger flared inside me, anger at her cruelty, her arrogance, her utter lack of respect for the home we built and the memories it held. But as quickly as it came, it burned itself out. This wasn't about rage. It wasn't even about revenge. Ethan hadn't designed this plan to punish her for the sake of punishment. He had designed it to protect me, to protect our family's name, and to ensure that his legacy was not destroyed by her greed. Justice. That was the word that settled in my chest. Not the loud kind you see in courtrooms, not the fiery kind that comes from shouting or fists. This was the quiet kind, the patient kind, the kind that waits in the shadows, lets arrogance overreach, and then reveals the truth at the perfect moment. I realized then that my role was both simple and impossibly difficult. I had to vanish. I had to become exactly what she thought I was, a broken, defeated old man, cast aside and forgotten. It would mean enduring the knowledge that she was out there celebrating, tearing down Ethan's library, squandering what she thought was her fortune. It would mean staying silent while she danced on the grave of everything I loved. But that silence would be my weapon. My absence would be the bait that lured her deeper into Ethan's design. And when the time came, the trap would spring, not with shouts or chaos, but with the cold, undeniable weight of the truth. I lay back on the creaking mattress, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. For the first time since Ethan's death, I felt something more than grief. I felt resolve. Vanessa thought she had ended me, that she had locked me out of my son's life forever. But she didn't know the truth. Ethan's hand was still guiding me, still protecting me. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. While I sat in that shabby motel room, keeping to the shadows as Callahan instructed, Vanessa exploded into the world like a firework. She didn't move quietly, didn't wait for the dust of grief to settle. No, she sprinted headlong into her new identity as though she had been rehearsing it all her life. Her first stop was the boutiques downtown. I would later hear the details from Callahan's investigator, a man who followed her like a shadow. She swept into those glittering stores not as a shopper but as a conqueror. Handbags that cost more than my first house, shoes with red soles that gleamed like fresh blood, jewelry heavy enough to weigh down her neck. She claimed them all with the swipe of a card, laughing as clerks fawned over her. She wasn't buying possessions. She was buying validation, proof to the world that she was untouchable now. From there, she moved to the car dealership. Not the kind where families buy sedans, but the kind with polished concrete floors and more security guards than vehicles. She didn't test drive or even hesitate. She pointed at the most ostentatious sports car in the showroom, a sleek crimson machine with doors that lifted like wings, and laid down a non-refundable deposit without blinking. When the salesman asked about the balance, she chuckled, her laughter dripping with condescension. "Oh, as soon as the estate paperwork clears. Don't worry, the money is there." But it wasn't just about indulgence. She wanted to erase Ethan's memory as quickly as possible, to scrub the house clean of him like chalk from a board. She hired a designer, one infamous for his cold, sterile style. White walls, glass, steel. The exact opposite of the warmth Ethan had built into every room. She walked him through the house like a queen giving orders to her court. The oak floors? Rip them out. The cozy furniture? Sell it. The photographs, the keepsakes, the little traces of a life well lived. Garbage. And then she led him to the library. Ethan's sanctuary. Our sanctuary. "This room," she declared, her voice cold enough to freeze the air, "is a morgue. All these books, this heavy wood. It's depressing. I want it gutted. White walls, mirrors, maybe a juice bar over there." She pointed directly at the corner where Ethan's favorite reading chair had sat for years. When Callahan told me that part, my chest tightened until I could barely breathe. She wasn't just redecorating, she was exorcising him, erasing him, cleansing the house of every memory that tied it to love instead of wealth. And still, I said nothing. I stayed hidden, as Ethan's plan required. She thought she was building a kingdom on his grave. What she didn't know was that the foundation beneath her feet was already cracking. 3 nights after she threw me into the rain, Vanessa held a celebration. Not a quiet gathering of family to honor Ethan's memory, but a spectacle, a coronation. Callahan's investigator painted me the picture, and I could see it in my mind as clearly as if I had been standing in the doorway myself. The house was filled with strangers, people who had never once set foot there while my son was alive. Champagne flowed like water, the music throbbed through the walls, and Vanessa stood in the center of it all like a queen finally seated on her throne. She wore a glittering gown, the kind you only see in magazines, and her laughter rose above the music, sharp and triumphant. Every trace of Ethan, the photographs, the books, the quiet warmth, was gone or shoved into boxes. In their place were flashing lights, endless bottles, and the shallow worship of people, drawn not to her heart, but to her fortune. At some point during the night, one of these new companions asked about me, about Ethan's father. Vanessa paused, putting on a face of false sorrow. She pressed her hand dramatically to her chest and sighed. "Oh, Samuel," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "The poor man couldn't handle the grief. He's checked himself into a little nursing home up north. It's for the best. He doesn't belong in this world anymore." Her words reached me later, delivered in Callahan's measured tone, and yet they struck me like a blade. Not anger, not rage, something colder. Pity. I pictured her, drunk on attention, spinning lies to hide the truth of what she had done. She wasn't strong, she wasn't clever. She was desperate, clinging to her illusion of power. The investigator told me how the crowd murmured sympathetically, some even praising her strength, her resilience. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know she had turned my son's home into a stage for her performance, or that the curtains were already beginning to fray. As I listened to Callahan describe it all, I felt something inside me shift. Not a desire to scream or confront her, but a deep, heavy calm. She was dancing in a house of cards, toasting to a future that didn't exist. Every laugh, every careless boast, every cruel dismissal was only pulling the noose tighter around her neck. Ethan had known her arrogance would destroy her. He had given her all the rope she needed. That night, in her glittering gown, surrounded by shallow applause, Vanessa thought she had won. But I knew better. The storm she believed she had weathered was only gathering strength, and soon the first cracks would show. The morning after her grand party was supposed to be the first day of her reign. Vanessa woke late, sunlight streaming through the master bedroom she now occupied alone. The caterers had cleaned every trace of spilled champagne and shattered glass, leaving the house gleaming, ready for its new queen. She must have felt untouchable as she slid into Ethan's luxury sedan and drove downtown, her designer sunglasses hiding eyes still heavy from the night before. Her first stop was a jewelry boutique, one of those places where the cases are lit like altars and the prices are whispered rather than spoken. She tried on necklaces, rings, watches, her laughter bright and sharp as clerks hurried to flatter her. She waved a black card linked directly to the estate's account, the one she had boasted about just nights earlier. The clerk ran it once, then again. A faint frown touched his lips. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly. "The card's been declined." Vanessa blinked, confused, then forced a laugh. "That's impossible. Try it again." He did. Declined. Again. Her smile faltered. Heat prickled at her neck as she pulled out another card, also tied to the estate. Declined. For the first time since Ethan's funeral, fear crept into her perfect mask. She snapped her fingers for her assistant, paid with promises rather than wages, to settle the matter with cash. But the girl had none, and Vanessa, fumbling through her handbag, found only a few crumpled bills. She shoved them across the counter, grabbed her bag, and stormed out without another word. She drove to a cafe, trying to steady herself. Surrounded by the city's wealthy, she ordered the most expensive coffee on the menu, as though that simple act could restore her sense of control. But when she presented her card, the barista gave the same apologetic shake of the head. Declined. Again. A woman at the next table glanced over, curious, giddy in her eyes, and Vanessa felt the sting of humiliation burn her cheeks. She threw down the last of her cash and fled. In her car, her hands shook as she dialed the private banking line. "There must be some mistake," she snapped when the representative answered. "I am the sole beneficiary of the Miller estate. That money is mine." The banker's tone was calm, professional, maddeningly even. "Yes, Mrs. Miller, but there has been a temporary procedural hold placed on all accounts by the estate's executor. Standard practice pending full asset valuation and probate court filings. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do." Vanessa's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. For the first time, she felt the walls of her gilded cage pressing in. She had believed she was a queen, but what she held in her hands was an illusion, and illusions, no matter how dazzling, always fade. By the time Vanessa pulled into the driveway that afternoon, her nerves were frayed to threads. The red sports car she had bragged about was still sitting in the dealership, unpaid for. The designer she had hired to gut the library had left angry messages demanding payment. Even the caterers from her grand party had begun sending invoices marked in bold red, past due, and all the while, every card swipe, every phone call to the bank ended with the same answer: procedural holds, probate filings, delays. She stormed into the living room, heels striking the marble like hammers. Her hands shook as she dialed Callahan's number, jabbing the screen with manicured nails. The moment he picked up, she unleashed her fury. "What have you done?" she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. "Why are my accounts frozen? Why can't I access my money? This is my estate, my inheritance, and you work for me. Do you hear me? You work for me." On the other end, Callahan's tone was maddeningly steady. "Mrs. Miller, I understand your frustration. However, as executor, I am legally bound to ensure the proper settlement of your late husband's estate. These are standard measures." "Standard measures?" she shrieked, cutting him off. "There's nothing standard about this. You're deliberately sabotaging me." He paused, then spoke with the calm precision of a surgeon. "Every action I have taken is lawful and required. Asset valuations, tax assessments, probate filings, these are not suggestions. They are obligations. I am simply following the letter of the law." Vanessa's breath came in ragged gasps. She wanted to shout louder, to claw through the phone line and bend him to her will, but his unshakable composure was like a mirror, reflecting her desperation back at her. The more she raged, the smaller she seemed. "You think you can control me?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. "You think you can hold me hostage in my own home?" Callahan's reply was quiet but sharp as steel. "Mrs. Miller, the law controls us all, even you." For a moment there was silence on both ends of the line. Vanessa's chest heaved. Her reflection in the grand mirror across the room looked nothing like the triumphant queen she had been at her party. She looked cornered, wild-eyed, stripped of the illusion she had worn so proudly. With a final incoherent threat, she slammed the phone onto the table so hard. The screen cracked. The sound echoed through the empty house, bouncing off walls that suddenly felt too big, too hollow. She thought she had inherited power, but all she had inherited was a cage, and the bars were tightening with every passing day. The days that followed were the longest Vanessa had ever lived. The silence in the mansion grew heavier with each passing hour, no longer filled with music or laughter, but with the echo of unpaid debts. The caterers sent another notice, this one stamped with the threat of legal action. The interior designer emailed a scathing message demanding compensation for his wasted time. Even the dealership, once so eager to please her, called again, this time with icy formality, informing her that her deposit was forfeited and the car had been sold to another buyer. Her glittering empire was turning to dust, and it was happening faster than she could comprehend. The friends who had swarmed around her during her party disappeared just as quickly as they had come. Calls went unanswered, texts left unread. The same people who had toasted her name with champagne now acted as though she didn't exist. For all her boasting, she was nothing to them without money in her hands. She began to feel it then, that creeping fear that slithered into the cracks of her confidence. The house was enormous, but its rooms echoed like cathedrals of failure. The walls she had stripped bare for her designer's vision stared back at her, mocking her emptiness. Even her reflection seemed foreign, a queen without a crown, clutching a phone that connected her to no one. By the 5th day, Vanessa's anger had burned itself out, leaving only desperation. The mighty sole inheritor of $72 million couldn't even cover her overdue bills. She paced the marble floors barefoot, her manicured nails chipped, her phone clutched in trembling hands. There was only one conclusion her mind could cling to. She needed Samuel. It must have enraged her to think it, to realize the same man she had tossed into the rain with nothing but a suitcase now held the key to her survival. Perhaps she believed she could bully me into reversing Callahan's decisions, or manipulate me with lies about family and grief. Maybe she thought my heart would still soften, that the old man she had humiliated would come running if she shed a few well-placed tears. So she searched. She drove to the homes of my oldest friends, knocking on doors she had once passed with disdain. But at every doorstep she was met with firm, polite refusals. "I'm sorry, Vanessa, we haven't seen him." "No, he hasn't called." Her voice cracked as she pressed for answers, but no one opened their doors wider than a sliver. The irony was cruel and perfect. She, the self-proclaimed queen, was now the one being shut out, the one unwelcome. By evening, she slumped in her car outside the mansion, staring at her own reflection in the windshield. The empire she thought she controlled had slipped through her fingers like sand. She was no longer a ruler, no longer untouchable. She was just a woman alone, terrified, and with now else to turn. On the morning of the 6th day, the phone in my motel room rang. The old landline buzzed and crackled, its sound pulling me from a restless sleep. I lifted the receiver, half expecting more bad news, but Callahan's voice came through calm and steady. "Samuel," he said, "it's time. She's coming here today." For a long moment I said nothing, listening to the hum of the line, feeling the weight of those words sink into me. Time. The word carried finality, like the striking of a clock at the end of a long countdown. Vanessa had reached the point Ethan predicted she would, stripped of her illusions, cornered by her own arrogance, and finally ready to face the truth. Callahan continued, his tone clipped with precision. "I've arranged for you to be here before she arrives. Wear your best suit, not because she deserves the respect, but because your son deserves to see you carry this moment with dignity." I hung up and stared at the cheap dresser across the room. On top of it lay my navy blue suit, folded with the care of a man who hadn't had reason to wear it in years. It was the same suit I wore at Ethan's wedding, the same suit I wore at his funeral. Now it would serve one last purpose, not as armor, but as a symbol. When I arrived at Callahan's office later that morning, the receptionist showed me into the waiting room. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and leather, a sharp contrast to the stale motel I had been living in. I sat down on a worn leather chair, a book of Roman history open in my lap. Not because I was truly reading, but because I needed something steady in my hands, something that tethered me. Minutes ticked by. Then the door opened. Vanessa stood on the threshold, and for the first time since Ethan's death, she didn't look invincible. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, and her eyes wide with a fear she could no longer hide. She scanned the room, probably searching for Callahan, perhaps rehearsing the lies she had planned to tell. But then her gaze found me. The expression on her face shifted in an instant, from confusion to shock to horror. She had believed me gone, erased, a relic tossed into obscurity. But there I was, sitting calmly, waiting. She froze, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and damning. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. My presence alone was enough. The man she had discarded was sitting at the very heart of the trap, and for the first time she realized she was no queen at all. She was a pawn. Vanessa lingered in the doorway, her hand still clutching the frame as if it were the only thing holding her upright. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. I lowered my book slowly, marking the page with my finger, and lifted my eyes to hers. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, until she finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel." She swallowed hard, then tried again, forcing a word that sounded foreign in her mouth. "Father." The word rang hollow, a performance meant to soften the edges of the truth she had carved into me with her cruelty. I said nothing. I let the silence do what words never could. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an anchor, for some lifeline, but there was none. She stepped inside, her heels clicking nervously on the hardwood, and tried again. "I've been looking for you everywhere. I was worried." The lie was pitiful, her voice cracked at the edges, her rehearsed concern falling apart the moment it left her lips. I kept my eyes on her, steady and unyielding. I did not frown, I did not smile, I simply existed as the mirror she could not escape. And in that mirror she was forced to see herself, greed, cruelty, arrogance laid bare. Her composure broke. She wrung her hands, her voice tumbling out in disjointed fragments. They got out of control. I wasn't thinking. The stress, the grief, it made me say things I didn't mean. Still, I said nothing, and that silence crushed her more than any accusation ever could. Just as the weight of the moment threatened to smother her completely, the inner door opened. Callahan stepped into the room, his dark suit crisp, his expression calm but resolute. He looked at her, then at me, his eyes carrying a silent message. It was time. "Mrs. Miller," he said evenly, gesturing toward the conference room. "If you'll join us, we can begin." Vanessa hesitated, her body rigid, as though her legs no longer trusted her. But the authority in Callahan's voice left her no room to refuse. With a shallow nod, she followed him, each step sounding heavier than the last. I rose from my chair, setting the book carefully on the side table, and straightened my suit jacket. I felt no tremor in my hands, no weakness in my knees. For the first time in weeks, my body carried itself with the dignity Ethan had always believed I possessed. As we walked toward the conference room, I saw the last remnants of her bravado peel away. She was no longer the triumphant widow, no longer the queen of a false empire. She was a defendant, being led into judgment, and she knew it. The conference room was silent when we entered. A long, polished mahogany table stretched between us, gleaming under the soft light. Callahan took his place at the head of it, his hands resting neatly on a folder. I sat on his right, my back straight, my breathing steady. Vanessa lowered herself into the chair across from me, her movements stiff, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For the first time since Ethan's death, she looked small. Callahan cleared his throat, his tone measured and professional. "Mrs. Miller, you're here today because you found yourself unable to access the assets of your late husband's estate. This is not a mistake. This is not a delay that can be swept away with a phone call. It is, in fact, the direct result of your own actions." Vanessa's lips parted, ready to protest, but he held up a hand, silencing her before she could utter a word. He slid a document across the table, its pages crisp, its weight undeniable. "This," he said, tapping the first page, "is a sworn affidavit from your father-in-law, Samuel Miller. It details the events of last week, how you forcibly expelled him from the family home, the only other living member of Italians, Hand's bloodline, and instructed him, in your own words, to go die in the street." The words struck her like blows. Her face drained of color, her hands tightening in her lap until her knuckles blanched. She looked at me then, her mouth opening as if to form some denial, some weak excuse, but I simply met her gaze with silence, the memory of her cruelty hanging in the air like a noose. Callahan's voice cut through, calm but relentless. "You see, Mrs. Miller, that first will you clung to so tightly, it wasn't the final word. It was a question, a test designed by your husband. He needed to know if you were worthy of being the steward of his life's work, his family, his legacy. And in less than a week, you answered that question with absolute clarity." Vanessa shook her head, trembling, her lips quivering as if searching for the right words. But there were none. She had condemned herself with her own actions, her own arrogance. Callahan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "You were given the chance to honor Ethan, to honor his father, to choose compassion over greed, and you failed." The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa's chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Her empire of $72 million, her glittering parties, her smug triumph. It was all crumbling in this quiet room, undone not by force, but by truth. And as I sat there, watching her unravel, I realized Ethan had known her better than she knew herself. His trap wasn't cruel, it was just... Callahan let the silence linger, heavy and unbearable, before reaching into his briefcase. He withdrew a thick envelope, sealed with the kind of wax stamp Ethan had once used for private letters. The red wax gleamed under the light as Callahan laid it gently on the table. Vanessa's eyes widened, her breath catching, as though she sensed her fate inside that envelope. "This," Callahan said slowly, "is the codicil. A second will, sealed by Ethan himself, to be opened only if the conditions of the first were broken. Those conditions, Mrs. Miller, were your duty to preserve the Miller family and its legacy. By casting Samuel into the street, you triggered this document. And now, the true inheritance is revealed." He broke the seal with steady hands, sliding out the pages, and began to read aloud. Ethan's words filled the room, his voice carried through Callahan's measured tone. "To my wife, Vanessa Miller, I leave a modest stipend of $3,000 per month contingent upon her employment in meaningful work to ensure she maintains a life of discipline and humility. Beyond this, she inherits nothing." Vanessa gasped, the sound sharp and strangled, as if the very air had been ripped from her lungs. Her hands flew to her chest, clawing at the fabric of her blouse, but Callahan continued, unshaken. "To my father, Samuel Miller, I leave full authority over my estate, including all assets, investments, and holdings, to be held in trust under his stewardship. I know my father's wisdom and integrity will preserve my legacy and honor the sacrifices he made for me when I was young." I closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of Ethan's trust settling on my shoulders like a mantle. My son had not abandoned me. He had given me everything. Not as wealth, but as responsibility. Vanessa's chair screeched against the floor as she lurched forward, her voice breaking into a desperate scream. "No, that's a lie! He would never! He promised me! This is fraud! This is manipulation!" Callahan calmly slid another document across the table, Ethan's signature and notary seal staring back at her. This is Ethan's handwriting, his signature, his legal witness. It is beyond dispute. This is his final word. Her hands shook violently as she snatched up the page, scanning it through blurred tears. Her voice dropped to a pitiful whimper. This can't be real. It can't. But it was real. The empire she had paraded before the world, the fortune she had flaunted like a crown, was gone in an instant, reduced to a meager stipend that chained her to a life of labor. And in that moment, as her cries echoed through the conference room, I saw the truth with perfect clarity. Ethan had not left her powerless. He had left her with exactly what she deserved. The papers slipped from Vanessa's trembling hands and scattered across the polished table like fallen leaves. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as she pushed back from her chair, the legs scraping the floor with a shriek. For a moment she stood there, swaying, her eyes wild, her lips forming words that never came. Then her knees buckled. She crumpled onto the carpet, clutching at her chest as though she could hold her broken world together with her bare hands. Callahan did not move. He simply folded the remaining documents into his folder, his face composed, as though he had witnessed scenes like this before. But I could see the flicker of pity in his eyes, a fleeting acknowledgement of the human wreckage before him. I remained still, my hands resting lightly on the table, watching as the woman who had once strutted through Ethan's home like a queen now writhed on the floor like a child robbed of her toys. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet, steady certainty. This was never about vengeance. It was about truth, and the truth had revealed itself. Vanessa finally lifted her face, streaked with mascara, her voice breaking in hoarse sobs. He hated me. He must have hated me. The words twisted something deep inside me, not because they were true, but because she couldn't see the reality. Ethan had loved her once. He had given her every chance to stand beside him with dignity. But love without respect withers into nothing, and she had killed whatever remained the moment she chose cruelty over compassion. I rose slowly from my chair, my joints stiff but my back straight. I looked down at her, not with anger, but with the solemn weight of finality. He didn't hate you, Vanessa. He simply knew you, and he prepared for the day your mask would fall. She whimpered, shaking her head, her hands clawing at the carpet as though she could dig her way out of the truth. But there was no escape. Ethan's voice, immortalized in ink, had spoken. Callahan cleared his throat softly, signaling the close of the meeting. The matter is settled. The estate will transition into Samuel's trust effective immediately. Mrs. Miller, your stipend will be arranged within 30 days, contingent upon proof of employment. Until then, I suggest you prepare yourself for a different kind of life. Vanessa's sobs filled the room, jagged and hollow. I, too, turned away, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing more to see. Justice had already been written. My role was no longer to watch her fall, but to carry Ethan's legacy forward. And as I stepped toward the door, I felt a strange peace settle over me. My son's wisdom had endured beyond death, and through it, he had given me not revenge, but vindication. 6 months passed, and the world had shifted in ways I could never have imagined. The Crestview Motel was behind me now, its peeling walls and buzzing neon sign nothing more than a shadow in memory. I stood instead in a new building, one that hummed with life and purpose. The Ethan Miller Foundation, my son's name carved into the stone at the entrance, not as a monument to wealth, but as a promise to the future. Inside, the halls echoed not with silence, but with the laughter and chatter of young people, students, scholars, dreamers, the kind of souls Ethan always believed in. They carried books under their arms, laptops glowing with ideas, notebooks filled with scribbles of ambition. Some were the first in their families to go to college, others carried the weight of brilliance with no means to nurture it, and here they were, given a chance because of my son's vision. I spent my mornings in the library we rebuilt, shelves filled not with the dust of neglect, but with fresh volumes, donated works, and Ethan's own carefully preserved collection. His favorite chair sat in the corner, polished and restored, not as a relic, but as a symbol. When I sat there, I felt his presence beside me, as if he were still leaning forward, talking about possibilities, about tomorrow. The foundation wasn't just about books or scholarships. It was about creating opportunities Ethan never had in his early years. We funded small startups for young innovators, paid stipends for artists, and built community programs in neighborhoods long forgotten by the world. Every grant signed, every scholarship awarded, felt like a heartbeat of Ethan's legacy living on. Reporters sometimes came, asking for statements, wanting me to speak about the downfall of Vanessa Miller. They wanted drama, headlines about her fall from grace, about the billionaire widow turned pauper. I refused every time. This was not about her. It never was. She had written her own story with the choices she made. My story, Ethan's story, was about what came after, about planting seeds where greed had once tried to scorch the earth. In quiet moments, I would walk the halls alone, listening to the hum of voices, the scratching of pens, the clicking of keyboards, and I would whisper to myself, "This is what you wanted, Ethan. This is what you built. I'm only carrying it forward." The weight of $72 million no longer felt like a fortune to guard or flaunt. It felt like a tool, a bridge, a way of building futures out of the rubble of the past. My son had turned his life into something larger than himself, and through him, I had found a purpose greater than revenge. I was no longer the man thrown into the rain. I was a steward of legacy, a builder of hope, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. While the foundation thrived, Vanessa's life unraveled in quiet, merciless ways. The mansion that once glowed with chandeliers and parties was sold off piece by piece, the funds redirected to settle debts and cover legal costs. Her name, once spoken in fashionable circles, faded into silence. No more glittering gowns, no more champagne toasts, no more followers trailing behind her laughter. The world that had celebrated her vanished, leaving her alone with only the echo of what she thought she had won. The stipend Ethan had arranged, $3,000 a month, contingent upon proof of employment, became her lifeline. It was a humiliating leash, one that forced her to face a world she had always considered beneath her. For the first time, she had to apply for jobs, fill out forms, and sit across from managers who looked at her not as a queen, but as another applicant among many. Eventually, she found work in a small boutique downtown, a far cry from the glittering designer stores she had once swept through with arrogant commands. Now she folded shirts, arranged displays, and smiled at customers who barely noticed her name tag. Her hands, once adorned with diamonds, grew dry from handling fabric and cleaning hangers. Her feet ached from standing all day in sensible shoes instead of stilettos. Sometimes I would hear whispers about her, a former party guest spotting her behind the counter, a neighbor passing her on the bus. Their tones varied, some mocking, some pitying, but all carried the same truth. Vanessa was no longer a woman of power. She was simply a woman, humbled by life, stripped of the illusions she had once worn like armor. I saw her once, purely by chance. I was leaving a meeting at the foundation when she stepped out of a cafe across the street, her uniform neat but plain, her hair tied back in a simple knot. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no fire in hers, no defiance, no venom, only weariness. She lowered her gaze almost immediately and hurried down the sidewalk, blending into the crowd. I felt no triumph, no lingering bitterness, only a faint, quiet pity. She had chosen her path, and the consequences had followed. Ethan had given her a chance to prove herself worthy, and she had squandered it. Now she lived the life she had mocked, a life built not on power, but on work. As I watched her disappear into the crowd, I whispered a silent prayer, not for her redemption, but for peace, because in the end, she was not my concern anymore. My concern was the legacy Ethan entrusted to me, the light I was sworn to keep burning. The library was the first place I rebuilt once the foundation took shape. Ethan's sanctuary, the room Vanessa had once dismissed as a morgue, became the beating heart of the new building. I wanted it to look as he would have imagined it, a place not of dust and silence, but of voices and discovery. The shelves, once stripped bare, were now alive with volumes, donations from universities, private collectors, and even students who brought their own books to leave behind as a token of gratitude. Every day, the space hummed with energy. Young men and women filled the long wooden tables, their notebooks spread wide, laptops, glowing pens scratching across paper. The air carried the scent of coffee and ink, punctuated by the soft rustle of pages turning. Where Vanessa once saw junk, I saw the spark of minds at work, seeds of possibility waiting to take root. I often found myself in the far corner, where Ethan's favorite leather chair had been restored. I left it exactly as it had been, though now it sat beside a small brass plaque that read, "In memory of Ethan Miller, who whose dreams live on in every mind that dares to learn. Students would sometimes sit in it when they studied, unaware of its history, and I never stopped them. That was how Ethan would have wanted it: his chair, his books, his sanctuary, shared with others who carried the same hunger he once did. Some afternoons I walked the aisles, running my fingers across the spines of books the way I had when Ethan was a boy. I remembered how his eyes used to light up when he discovered a new story, how he once begged me for a rare edition and spent weeks saving his allowance to buy it. That same passion now flickered in the faces of strangers, and in them I saw my son's spirit alive and thriving. There were moments when I would pause at the window, the same kind Ethan had insisted on when we first built the shelves. Sunlight streamed through it, casting golden beams across the rows of books. I could almost hear his voice beside me, filled with that quiet determination that carried him from nothing to greatness. "One day, Dad, people will come here not just to read, but to dream." And now they did. The library was no longer mine alone, nor was it Ethan's. It belonged to every student who walked through its doors, every dreamer who sat down at a table and dared to imagine a future brighter than their past. In their voices, in their laughter, in their learning, I found the echo of my son's heart. It was here, more than anywhere else, that I felt his legacy alive, not in money, not in power, but in the quiet turning of pages and the steady pursuit of knowledge. Justice, I came to learn, is not always loud. It doesn't always roar in courtrooms or march with banners in the streets. Sometimes justice is quiet. It moves like water through cracks in stone, patient and unstoppable. Ethan had known that. He hadn't sought revenge against Vanessa. He had sought truth. He wanted her to reveal herself, to show the world exactly who she was, without the mask of wealth or charm. And when she did, his plan unfolded with the precision of a clock striking midnight. I never lifted a hand against her. I never raised my voice. All I did was wait. And in that waiting, she destroyed herself. That is the power of patience, the kind of patience my son believed in. Now, when I walk through the halls of the foundation, past students clutching books and laughing together, I feel a peace I never thought I would know again. Ethan's dream didn't die with him. It grew. His fortune, once nearly squandered by greed, became a tool to lift others, to open doors that had been locked for too long, and I, an old man once left in the rain with nothing, had found my purpose in carrying it forward. As for Vanessa, I hear her name less and less with each passing month. She's just another face in the crowd now, her glittering empire reduced to a uniform and a paycheck. I bear her no hatred. Her punishment is not poverty. It is knowing she had the world in her hands and lost it because of her own choices. That knowledge will follow her longer than any chain. Sometimes I wonder if Ethan can see all this, if he knows his plan worked, if he knows his legacy is alive. I like to believe he does. I like to believe that somewhere, in some way, he is smiling, knowing that the wisdom he left behind continues to guide me, continues to build. And so, my story ends not in anger, but in peace. Betrayal tried to break me, but it only revealed the strength my son left me with. Wealth tried to corrupt, but in the right hands, it became a light for others. And arrogance tried to erase love, but love proved stronger. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that patience and wisdom can outlast even the deepest betrayals. And before you leave, tell me in the comments what legacy you would want to leave behind. Because in the end, that's what truly matters. Not what we take, but what we give.